Genesis chapter 14, verse number 1, the Bible says, "And it came to pass in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Eleazar, Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of nations, that these made war with Bera, king of Sodom, and with Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, and Shemeber, king of Zeboam, and the king of Bela, which is Zoar. All these were joined together in the vale of Siddim, which is the salt sea. 12 years they served Kedorlaomer, and in the 13th year they rebelled. In the 14th year came Kedorlaomer and the kings that were with him, and smote the Rephaims in Ashtaroth Karnaim, and the Zuzims and Ham, and the Emims and Sheva Kirathim, and the Horites in their Mount Seir, unto El-Paran, which is by the wilderness. And they returned and came to Ishmat, which is Kadesh, and smote all the country of the Amalekites, and also the Amorites that dwelt in Hazath-Tamar. And there went out of the king of Sodom, and the king of Gomorrah, and the king of Admah, and the king of Zeboam, and the king of Bela, the same as Zoar, and they joined battle with them in the vale of Siddim, with Kedorlaomer the king of Elam, and with Tidal the king of nations, and Amraphel king of Shinar, and Arioch king of Eleazar, 4 kings with 5. And the vale of Siddim were full of slime pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled and fell there, and they that remained fled to the mountains. And they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah, and all their victuals, and went their way. And they took Lot, Abram's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed." Lot is mentioned here in verse number 12. Now, Lot, and we'll comment more in a little while, but Lot was a righteous man according to the New Testament. If you'll hold your place here in Genesis chapter 14, but if you'll look at 2 Peter chapter number 2, 2 Peter chapter number 2, verse number 7, it says here, it says, "And delivered just Lot." Now, this is later, which we've not covered yet, but it says, "And delivered just Lot, vexed with the filthy conversation of the wicked." That is in reference to Sodom and Gomorrah. "For that righteous man dwelling among them, and seeing and hearing, vexed his righteous soul from day to day with their unlawful deeds." Now, this is where later we'll see a few chapters from now where he's there in Sodom and Gomorrah, and there's wickedness going on, and it says that he was vexed with what was happening. But again, Lot is told to us that he was this righteous man, according to 2 Peter chapter number 2, but he's united with the wrong crowd. If you look here, back in Genesis chapter 13, verse number 12, verse number 12 says, "And Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent toward Sodom." So now, remember, according to chapter 13, he's not in Sodom yet. But it seems like by chapter 14, he's now living there. And after the fact, he'll be living there as well. And look at verse 13. It says, "But the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly." And so these kings that we've already read about in the first 12 verses, and again, like I said, I know that was a lengthy read this morning as we started, but these kings, you have Amraphel, you have Arioch, you have Kedorlaomer, and you have Tidal here. These kings, they're from outside the area, but they have some level of control over these cities of the plain, over these areas that they're getting tribute, and we saw that there, and later in the verses there. And finally, these cities rise up and say, "We're not paying your tribute anymore." And so what happens? Well, these kings get together, and they come, and they're going to fight these cities and this area, and do battle with them. And Lot gets mixed up in with it because why? He's living in Sodom. He's living in that area. Now, more about that in a little bit. Notice here these participants, and we've mentioned these names, and I want to kind of identify a few of these, and I don't want to stay too long on anything because there's a lot to cover in this chapter. Notice here these kings of the east. Now these kings here, we have Amraphel, he's king of Shinar. Now Amraphel, Shinar, if you remember, is that land that we talked about a lesson or two ago where wickedness goes and has a place. Shinar is Babylon. Shinar is where modern-day Iraq is today. And Shinar, Babylon, that is going to, we know, is going to play a role in the future. And I think I said this many weeks ago now, but it's interesting how man can't get away from that area. Well, that's where everything started. Babylon, the Middle East, it all started there. And all eyes are on that area. But Shinar is Babylon, and we see Amraphel is king of Shinar. Now Shinar, we see here in verse number 2 is mentioned. These made war. Look at Genesis chapter 10, verse number 8. It says, "And Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Wherefore it was said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord." Notice verse number 10. "In the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and County, in the land of Shinar." So you see Shinar, Babylon, old Babylon, and then later newer Babylon. Listen, it has been there for centuries, for thousands of years. Babylon goes back to really, almost the beginning. And so, again, we're not dealing with a newcomer on the block, you might say, in our terminology. This area has been inhabited for years. And we see Nimrod was the one that was in charge of that early on. We see that in verse number 2 of chapter 11, again, it says, "And it came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar." Remember our study on the Tower of Babel. Again, we just see these connections here. But know that Babylon later is where Daniel will be. In Daniel chapter 1 and verse number 2. In fact, go ahead and turn over there, because I'm going to read just a little bit more there. Daniel chapter 1, verse number 2, it says, "And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah." Now this is later. And some of this I'm hoping and I'm banking on the fact you know some of your history of the Old Testament. You know your history of Israel. But Daniel chapter 1, verse number 2, remember Jehoiakim is the king. He was the king of Judah. That's the southern kingdom. After the kingdom was split, you have Jehoiakim here. He is taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar, by Babylon. And in verse number 2 it says, "And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand," that's Nebuchadnezzar, "with a part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried in the land of Shinar, to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God." Verse number 3, now I just want to read this because this gives us our connection here. "And the king spake unto Aspaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princes." Who is this? Look further down. Verse number 6. "Now among these were of the children of Judah, Daniel, Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah." By the way, those three are their Jewish names, or Hebrew names, before they're changed by Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego by the Babylonians. So you see Daniel here in verse number 6. So Daniel is in that very same spot, that Shinar that we're talking about right now. While it's a different reign, a different king, it's the same land that we're dealing with. Now, this Amraphel, and this is just from my research when I was teaching Genesis chapter 14 in the Institute, some have thought that this is Hammurabi. Hammurabi is, how many have heard the Hammurabi Code? Where it's one of the first justice system codes that they found, where it was man to man and how to deal with criminals and civil problems. Some have said that they believe that maybe this is Hammurabi. Others think that he lived later and he would have been in the time of Moses. Either way, it's interesting because people revere him. And that's going to be very interesting here in just a little while if this is indeed Hammurabi, because of what's going to happen with him and Abraham. Now, we also have Arioch, king of Eleazar. This would be the kingdom in Mesopotamia. If you remember, Mesopotamia is in that Fertile Crescent area. Mesopotamia is that area there. You have Kedorlaomer, he's king of Elam. Elam was a kingdom in Persia. Now, again, later, Babylon and Persia and all they're going to battle with each other. We see Persia later with Daniel chapter 8, where Daniel then is under the Persian rule. Remember, Daniel went from Babylonian rule to Persian rule and still kept a level of as an official in those kingdoms. You have Kedorlaomer, he is the leader of these kings. in all what's going on here. And you have title king of nations. Now these kings here are going to do battle with these kings in the cities of the plain. Of those you have Sodom and you have Gomorrah and you have other cities as well. Remember, I've already talked about how that they were paying tribute. These cities of the plain were paying tribute to Chedorlaomer, and they rebel against him. And so what does he do? He gets a force together with all these kings, and they're going to do battle. Now this battle takes place, and I handed out a map. So if you look at the map there, you're going to see where you have, I've underlined a few things. I've underlined Damascus. Damascus is going to be toward the upper end. If you see here, that's the journeys of the patriarchs. You see that line, that's supposed to be Abraham's migration. And you'll see there Damascus is underlined about halfway down that line. That's going to be important in just a little bit. You have the circle underneath the Dead Sea. We know it as the Dead Sea. That's also the Salt Sea or the Sea of the Plain sometimes. This is where, best we can tell, is where this Vale of Siddim is, where they end up with the slime pits that we just read about a little bit ago. That's the area where it's believed that this battle would have taken place, and they fell in those slime pits, and they do battle. And you see Jabesh. That would later be Jerusalem. And that's going to be important in just a little bit as we look through our lesson. So I want you to keep those things in your mind as we go along, and as you look at that map, that kind of gives you an idea of where these things take place. Now, these slime pits we see in verse number 10, and it says, "And the Vale of Siddim was full of slime pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled and fell there, and they that remained fled to the mountains." So some got away, others did not. They fell there in those slime pits. That's that southern end of the Dead Sea. And there also in that area, it is of interest that you have, these were pools of natural asphalt and tar. Now, I don't know about you, but you get into something like that, one, it can be slippery, but the other thing is you can't move. That's hard. It's hard to move around. And so if they get caught there, you can see where the battle is going to go bad for them. They're running for their lives. They can't get out, and then they're just getting picked off. You think about these nations that are coming down on top of them; they're just getting picked off as they're sitting there in those slime pits. So you can imagine what this would be like. We see the reason again is they rebelled against these cities of the plain. They had served for 12 years. Verse number 4. They rebelled in the 13th year. Chedorlaomer, he gets these kings with him, and they go against the Rephaims, the Zuzims, and the Emims. Now, we may look at this and go, well, you see this happening, and we see the connections here, and we look at this and we go, this Amraphel, he's king of Shinar. These are probably wicked people. Well, honestly, this battle, you got wicked people against wicked people, folks. But sometimes, you know what God does? He'll use a nation to send judgment on another nation. You do understand these Rephaims, Zuzims, and Emims. Many of these later will be identified as giants, according to Deuteronomy. In fact, if you would just go ahead and turn over there, some of these nations get picked off and get, let's just say they get cut down to size by these cities, by these kings from the east. God used the kings of the east to take care of some things that He's already prophesied needed to happen. Deuteronomy 2:10 says, "The Emims dwelt therein in times past, a people great and many and tall as the Anakims, which also were accounted giants as the Anakims, but the Moabites called them Emims." Now, I don't know if you can see in that inset map there that we have, but you see some of them, they're actually labeled there. Now, again, I'm sure that's relative, of where they might have been, but still we see those locations. So God is using these kings from the east to actually send judgment down on these cities of the plain and these other groups, these nations. God uses man sometimes to do His work. You see it in history. Many, many times, God will do that to send judgment. And it's God's arm that's having it done. This is important. This is important because individually, we see something going on. Sometimes we don't need to take action. Sometimes we need to stay out. I think as a nation, sometimes we need to stay out. Far too often we get involved in things that we have no business being involved in. Now, other times we should get involved. If it's for a righteous reason. But I'm going to be honest with you, many times, our nation doesn't get involved because of righteous reasons. We have an ulterior motive. And this all plays important because of what we see Abram do here in just a moment. Notice that these Horites in verse number 6 back in our passage, and it says, and the Horites in their Mount Seir unto El Paran, which is by the wilderness. So these Horites are in Mount Seir at this time. This is the country of Edom, which, by the way, Esau and his descendants will later inhabit. They'll fight for. But it's interesting that even the Lord is using these kings of the east to maybe cut these Horites down to size. Maybe it's because he knows, okay, I'm going to give Esau, that Esau's going to take that area later. You see God using a circumstance to take care of multiple things. See, that's our God. God can look at something and He knows in His infinite wisdom, His foreknowledge, hey, I'm going to allow this to happen. I'm going to bring this into this person's life simply because I need them to be positioned here because of what's going to happen here. And we can't think that way. We many times might think one step ahead or maybe two steps ahead. And maybe if we're really good, we're taking 3 and 4 steps ahead. But our God can look 15 steps out and go, well, I need them here because this is going to happen. And then when this happens, I need this to take place. See what's going on? I need to cut these nations down to size because my people are going to come to inherit. Some of them need to be wiped out. Some of them need to be small enough. And then also, Esau needs to have that place. That's God. That's God. The results of this battle is, in verse number 10 and 11, we see that this vale of Siddim, they fall into it. Sodom and Gomorrah flee. They fall here into this area, and some flee to the mountains. But notice here what happens. And they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their victuals and went their way. But verse 12 is very key. And they took Lot, Abram's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. If Lot had not been living in Sodom, he would not have been taken with Sodom. Now I understand we live in a nation, and please, I'm going to try to explain myself with that comment. We live in the world, but we don't have to be of the world. Just the same, maybe if you weren't with the wicked crowd, you wouldn't be accounted with the wicked crowd. It's not living in the world that makes you wicked, but eventually if you're doing wicked things with wicked people, you're going to turn wicked even if maybe you're not wicked at the start. And if you don't believe that, look several chapters ahead and see what happens with Lot's daughters and his married daughters. And he loses his son-in-laws, and he loses his daughters, and he loses his wife. One good apple amongst bad apples turns the good apple bad. And that is just a rule of nature. You put some good fruit with bad fruit. The good fruit doesn't make the bad fruit good. The bad fruit makes the other fruit rot. And it's the same with people. You may say, well, I'm a good person. You're not if you're running with the wrong crowd and you're doing wicked things. You're wicked. And even if Lot at heart, and we know that from 2 Peter chapter 2, we know that from the New Testament, he was a righteous man, but what did the righteous man do? he didn't do anything to change anything. And so he caused his next generation to go bad. Verse number 13, it says, and there came one that had escaped and told Abram the Hebrew. It works out that one escapes. He tells Abram what's going on. Of course, we know that's Abraham. The Lord will change his name to Abraham later. And they took Lot, Abram's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. And then we see, and there came one that had escaped and told Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelt in the plain of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and brother of Aner, and these were confederate with Abram. So Abram hears about his brother's nephew. He hears about what's going on. This is where things change. Abram is getting ready when he hears about this. Look at verse number 14. And when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his trained servants, born in his own house, 318, and pursued them unto Dan. Now, I don't think that's on the map there exactly, but Dan is north along that same route that he would have probably taken when he came into the land. He pursues them all the way up to Dan, up near Damascus. But notice that Abram, I'm sure maybe he's heard about the battle. Abram doesn't do anything about it. It doesn't involve him. This goes back to my statement a moment ago. Sometimes we want to get involved in something we have no business getting involved in as individuals, as a nation. But notice that when he hears Lot is taken, wait a minute, now you've stepped on my family. I have a vested interest. Same thing with our nation. We have a vested interest. That's different. I mean, I know we have some in our presence that's near and dear to them. I think we have a vested interest in Israel. Of any nation, we ought to be going to arms side by side with it, ought to be them. I mean, he'll bless them that bless thee and curse them that curseth thee. But notice here, Abram doesn't do anything until he hears Lot is taken. And when he hears Lot is taken, he says, okay, wait a minute. That's family. You've stepped on something now. And so what does he do? He goes after him. And he says, and he divided himself against them, he and his servants. Now understand that not only as he went, he'll end up having others that are going to go with him, with us. Those that were there with him, that help him. Notice he's confederate with Mamre, Eshcol, and Aner here in verse 18. You'll see. And so he pursues them all the way unto Dan. He divided himself against them, verse number 15, he and his servants by night, and smote them and pursued them into Hobah, which is on the left hand of Damascus. So again, if you look at your maps, you see Damascus there on the left-hand side. Again, not marked on the map, but Damascus is around that area. He pursues all the way there, and he attacks. But notice when he attacks, he does guerrilla warfare. Well, he's only 318 plus whatever the others are, right? We don't know, but he does something very smart. Now it's interesting. He's attacking at night. He does guerrilla style warfare. Something that nations have had to learn over centuries. He does here. It works. But the other thing is, God was with him. And notice here, divided himself against them, he and his servants by night, and smote them and pursued them into Hobah, which is on the left hand of Damascus, and he brought back all the goods. Now I want you to notice something. It didn't say he brought back some. He brought back most. He brought back all the goods. Hey, he did a complete and thorough job. You know what God wants from us? He wants a complete and thorough job. I don't know why it is we think we have to do a complete and thorough job for the boss. We have to do a complete and thorough job for the teacher. We have to do a complete and thorough job for the community. For the community. But when it comes to God, it says, well, that looks good enough. No, God wants our best. God wants all of us. God wants 110%. And we don't give 110%, we're laxing. And now that doesn't mean we think, oh, well, you mean church things. No. What a mom, dad, as a child, I know we don't have young ones in here, but when you're growing up, when your parents tell you to do this, you do it. Why is it we just think, well, I'm serving God if I'm doing this or that. No, you're serving God 24/7 in all that you do. But notice Abram, he does 110%. He brings back all the goods, and also brought again his brother Lot and his goods, and the women also, and the people. So, hey, he leaves these armies decimated. They're limping back. And the king of Sodom went out to meet him after his return from the slaughter of Kedorlaomer and of the kings that were with him at the valley of Sheva, which is in the king's Now, let me just mention this in passing. One of the reasons why some folks don't want to admit Hammurabi was one of these was because this looks like a black eye. And when you revere people in the world, you don't want not once do you want to say, well, you got this Bedouin shepherd that had 300 men went and beat this great and mighty king. Yeah, when he's got God on his side, he can. Hey, when God's on your side, when you're on God's side, I should say, there's amazing things you can do for him. And so we need to remember that. Now this king of Sodom went out, he meets him, and he meets him at the valley of the Sheva, which is in the king's dale. Now, this king's dale is just very close to Jabesh, which is later Jerusalem. So again, this gives you an idea of the area. He's very close to this. And now notice who comes out and meets him. And it says, and Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. Well, who is this Melchizedek? Well, number one, we see he's king of Salem, which means peace. Peace. And this is another name for Jerusalem. In Psalm 76, verse number 2, it says, in Salem also is his tabernacle, and his dwelling place is Zion. It's talking about Jerusalem. Notice, in Salem also is his tabernacle. So he's king of Salem. He's king of Salem. He's the priest of the Most High God, and he brings bread and wine, and he meets Abraham, or Abram at this time, there in the king's dale. Now, Melchizedek is an interesting character in the Bible. There has been a lot of debate as to who this man is. Now, I want you to hold your place, because we'll be back, but I want you to turn over to Hebrews chapter number 7. Chapter number 7, look at verse number 1. It says, for this Melchizedek, talking about this individual right here, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham, returning from the slaughter of the kings, and blessed him. What did he blessed him? Notice here, verse number 19. Again, we'll be back and forth, so hold your place in Hebrews 7. Now look back at verse number 19. And he blessed him and said, blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thine hand. And he gave him tithes of all. So Melchizedek blesses Abram. Notice. So this individual has the ability to bless, and he speaks to Abraham here. So now back in Hebrews chapter 7, verse number 2, to whom also Abraham gave a tenth part of all. So that's a tithe. Remember, it says back in Genesis, he tithed, and here we see a tenth. First being by interpretation, talking about Melchizedek, king of righteousness, and after that also king of Salem, which is king of peace. Now notice, talking about Melchizedek, it says, he was without father, without mother, without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like unto the Son of God, abideth a priest continually. Now consider how great this man was, unto whom even the patriarch Abraham gave the tenth of the spoils. And verily, they that are of the sons of Levi, who receive the office of the priesthood, talking about the Levitical priesthood now, the Levitical priesthood that would later be, it says, who receive the office of the priesthood, have a commandment to take tithes of the people according to the law, that is, of their brethren, though they come out of the loins of Abraham. But he whose descent is not counted from them received the tithes of Abraham, and blessed him that had the promises. Without contradiction, the less is blessed of the better. And here men that die receive the tithes, but there he receiveth them of whom it is witnessed that he liveth. So this man gets tithes from Abraham. Well, number one, what gives him right to get a tithe at all? But he says he's the priest of the Most High God. So who is this man? Well, he has the power to bless. He's greater than Abraham according to verses 4, 6, and 7 of chapter 7 of Hebrews. He's the priest of the Most High God. He liveth and abideth continually. Now, folks, if you don't agree with me this morning, because I know there's folks that don't think this way, that's fine. You can be wrong. I'm teasing. One day we'll stand before God and He'll work this out. But come on. He abideth forever. He liveth. Notice here, He liveth and abideth continually. And He's without father, without mother. I know some will argue, well, it's an angel. Okay, but angels had a beginning. Well, that leaves God. Folks, that leaves God. Here's what I believe you have. You have a pre-incarnate Jesus Christ. That's the only way you can reconcile this. And it's interesting, and we can't even get into this. But do you see that God was making a priesthood before the Son of God would be brought into the world, so that because he couldn't be of the Levitical priesthood because he's from Judah. The priest never came out of Judah, but it did because he gets the line of Melchizedek. So God made His own priesthood so that Jesus Christ would have a priesthood to step into. Do you think our God is always thinking of future things? Now, again, I've said this here before. So then, that blesses me because I know nothing takes my God by surprise. He's in tomorrow already. He's already making account for what needs to happen. He's already thinking of what I need. But more importantly, He's thought of everything. He's thought of my salvation. He's thought of my needs. He's thought of every last detail. That's the kind of God I serve. Not of wood, stone, not of man's device or art. He is my God. And boy, am I so glad that I have Him. A couple of things, we didn't mention this a moment ago, but when it says that Abram the Hebrew, that's the first time you have the name Hebrew in the Bible. Also, this is the first mention of tithes, and it's given to Melchizedek, which we believe is a pre-incarnate Jesus Christ. And the next thing we see here is that He blesses him. He said, "Blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thy hand." And He gave him tithes of all. And the king of Sodom, now, notice this, and the king of Sodom said unto Abram, "Give me the persons, and take the goods to thyself." He wants to reward Abraham. He says, "Hey, look, you've saved us from what could have happened." And Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted up mine hand unto the Lord, the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth. He says that I will not. So he just swore to the Lord, I will not take from a thread even to a shoe latchet, and that I will not take anything that is thine, lest thou shouldest say, I've made Abram rich. Now, folks, this is telling of what Sodom and Gomorrah was like. You know what he's saying? I don't want to have anything to do with you. I don't want to have anything to do with your wickedness, what you have. I don't want you to be able to go say, I made Abram rich. That's how vile this place was. Abram said, I've done this for Lot. You just happen to be a part of the package. And you know what? Sometimes we don't need to be getting our hands dirty with the things of the world just so we can have what we want. We need to stay clean before God. In fact, I believe it's 3 John chapter 1, verse number 7, that talks about, and yes, it says, because you have the apostles, and the apostle John says this about taking from the Gentiles. That would be the world then. It says, because that for His name's sake they went forth taking nothing of the Gentiles. He says, you know what? We're not going to take from the world to do God's work. And that's been kind of a rule for us at Antioch. That's why we don't have bake sales. That's why we don't have car washes. We're not going to take from the world. If God can't do it with God's people, then okay. And so Abram here, he refuses to receive that from the king of Sodom, and he made a promise before God. He made a vow. He made a vow before the Lord. And this was a vow made before God that he would not do these things. He says, so that I will not take from a thread even to a shoe latchet, and that I will not take anything that is thine, lest thou shouldest say, I have made Abram rich, save only that which the young men have eaten, and the portion of the men which went with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre. Let them take their portion. He says, if they want to take something, that's up to them. And also, by the way, the men that went with me, we ate some of the spoil because we needed sustenance. We needed to eat. But we're done. We're clear. I've done this for Lot. I've done this for Lot. And so what do we learn? We see God's provision, folks. You know, God took care of Lot even though Lot is on a slippery slope. God took care of Lot because of Abram. God took care of all this. God used Abram to take care of Lot. God used a man that the world would have looked at and said, there is absolutely no way he's going to take out these kings. And God said, watch this. And you know what? We see that too. We see that God can use you and you and you for his work. When things look little, God can do a lot. Little as much when God is in it. And so thank the Lord for his provision. Thank the Lord for, I don't know, it's these nuggets from God's word. You think about Melchizedek. What a story, just tucked away in a battle that takes place between Abram and the kings of the east. And God reveals himself here in verses 18 through 24. What a blessing.